Today, I want you to do something radical. Stop trying to become a millionaire and start living as someone who already is. Because if, by the end of this video, you change just one thing, the identity from which you think, decide, and perceive the world, you will have begun a transformation that no paycheck, no investment, and no lucky opportunity could ever give you on its own. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It was never a money problem. Maybe you believe you simply need to earn more. Find the right opportunity. Wait for better timing. Learn one more strategy. But what if all of those things are merely consequences, not the cause? There is one mistake that causes most people to manifest the exact opposite of what they want. And they repeat it every single day without realizing it. In a few minutes, you'll understand why. Because this mistake is so deeply woven into everyday life that it feels completely normal. Texto predeterminado. This video isn't about empty affirmations. It isn't another motivational speech designed to make you feel inspired for 5 minutes before everything goes back to normal. Instead, you're about to discover 7 principles capable of changing the way you create your reality. Not because they are magical, but because they transform the place where every thought, every decision, and every action begins. And when the source changes, the destination changes with it. But first, you need to understand something almost nobody teaches. Most people don't live intentionally. They live reactively. They react to the balance in their bank account. They react to the headlines. They react to other people's opinions. They react to fear. And then they call the outcome reality, without realizing they've spent years obeying a world that is simply reflecting who they believe they are. That is the silent danger. Not staying where you are, but allowing scarcity to become your identity. Because when an identity lives inside you long enough, it stops feeling like a belief. It starts feeling like a fact. And facts are rarely questioned. They're defended. Maybe you do this every single morning without noticing. You pick up your phone. You check your bank account. You compare your life to someone else's. You think about the bills waiting to be paid. You calculate how much longer until the end of the month. Then you tell yourself that once you earn more money, you'll finally start living differently. Without realizing it, you've just confirmed the same version of yourself once again. The version that waits. The version that needs. The version that still doesn't have enough. Now ask yourself something. From what identity did those thoughts come? Because this is where one of Neville Goddard's most revolutionary ideas appears. You do not manifest what you want. You manifest what you assume yourself to be. The difference sounds subtle, but it changes everything. If you constantly desire wealth, you're confirming that you don't believe you already possess it. If you're desperately chasing abundance, you're reinforcing the assumption that abundance still exists somewhere outside of you. And if every thought begins from absence, absence becomes the foundation of your life. No structure can ever rise above the quality of its foundation. Imagine an architect trying to build a skyscraper on unstable ground. He can have the best blueprint, the finest materials, the most talented construction team, but if the foundation is unstable, the entire building will eventually reveal that weakness. Identity works exactly the same way. Your habits are the walls. Your decisions are the windows. Your results are the finished building. But the foundation is always invisible. That's why so many people work harder, study more, visualize longer, repeat thousands of affirmations, and still feel as though nothing changes. Not because they're doing too little, but because they're building from the same identity. They try to attract abundance while continuing to feel scarce. They try to become successful while secretly defining themselves through limitation. It's like trying to change your reflection by hitting the mirror. It will never work. And here we arrive at one word that almost nobody associates with wealth. Yet it determines every lasting transformation. Identity. Not income, not luck, not connections. Identity. Because you will always act in alignment with who you believe you are. And whenever an opportunity contradicts that identity, you'll reject it, delay it, or unconsciously sabotage it, without even realizing you're doing it. That invisible mechanism is what keeps millions of people trapped inside the same story for years. They change jobs. They move to a different city. They leave relationships. They learn new strategies. But they never change the character they're living as. And an identity repeated long enough eventually becomes a repeated destiny. Throughout the rest of this video, we're going to dismantle that mechanism, not through abstract theories, but by understanding how the mind creates identity and how you can begin assuming a completely different one before the world gives you permission. Because abundance never begins in your bank account. It begins in the place where you decide who you are, before there is any evidence to support it. And that place is where true freedom begins. There is an almost invisible difference between observing reality and obeying it. At first, they seem like the same thing. They aren't. And that tiny difference determines the direction of an entire life. Most people believe they're being rational. They think they're simply analyzing the facts, making decisions based on evidence. But that's not what's really happening. What you call reality is rarely an objective observation. It's an interpretation, and that interpretation is filtered through the identity you've spent years building. Two people can experience the exact same situation. One sees opportunity, the other sees danger. One becomes curious, the other becomes afraid. The external world hasn't changed, the observer has. And this is where almost everyone misses the real problem. You don't react to what happens. You react to the meaning your identity assigns to what happens. That meaning exists before conscious thought, before you've even had time to decide. It's an automatic judgment, a silent program, a response you've repeated so many times that you've mistaken it for your personality. That's why people often say, "I'm just being realistic. I simply see things as they are." But many times what they call realism is nothing more than limited perception disguised as objectivity. Because if you've spent years assuming that money is always scarce, your mind will begin collecting evidence for that assumption everywhere. If you've assumed opportunities belong to other people, you'll overlook the one standing right in front of you. If you've assumed you're someone who never finishes what you start, every setback becomes proof. Not because it's true, but because your identity wants to remain consistent. And here's something fascinating. The brain is not primarily searching for truth. It's searching for consistency. It would rather preserve a familiar lie than accept a truth that requires rebuilding who you are. That's why change feels so uncomfortable. You're not fighting your circumstances. You're fighting an identity that's trying to survive. Imagine the thermostat inside your home. It doesn't matter how much you heat the room if the thermostat is still set to 65 degrees. The moment you stop adding heat, the system automatically returns to its previous setting. Most people try to change their lives by increasing effort. They work harder. They become more motivated. They visualize more. They read more books. But they never change the internal thermostat. So, eventually, they return to exactly where they started. That explains why someone can earn more money and lose it, build a successful business, and sabotage its growth, receive an extraordinary opportunity, only to let it slip away. The problem was never ability. It was the identity quietly regulating the entire system from behind the scenes. Neville Goddard repeated one idea that seems almost impossible the first time you hear it. Do not change the circumstances. Change the assumption. Because circumstances are the effect, assumption is the cause. Yet most people spend their entire lives trying to manipulate the effect. It's like trying to erase a shadow while leaving the object creating it exactly where it is. It can never work. But there's another enemy, even quieter. One that destroys abundance before it has a chance to appear. Comparison. Every time you compare your life to someone else's, you're teaching your mind that wealth exists outside of you, that success belongs to other people, that you're still waiting for your turn. Eventually, waiting becomes identity. Listen carefully to everyday conversations. When I make more money, when I finally get that promotion, when life gets easier, it sounds harmless. But hidden inside those words is dangerous programming. Because fulfillment is always postponed, always placed in the future, never experienced in the present. And once your mind learns that everything meaningful exists somewhere ahead, you'll never act from abundance, you'll only act from waiting. This is where another principle enters the picture: spiritual economics. This isn't about money, it's about where you invest your attention. Attention is the most valuable resource you possess. Every thought is an investment. Every sustained emotion compounds over time. Every conversation strengthens an identity. If you invest your attention in fear every day, fear compounds. If you invest your attention in scarcity, scarcity builds momentum, because your mind behaves like an investment account. Whatever receives consistent deposits grows, which leads to an uncomfortable question. How many hours each day are you spending reinforcing the very identity you're trying to escape? Every time you say, "I can't," there's never enough. Everything is too difficult. I'm just not that kind of person. You're making another deposit into the wrong account. Then you wonder why nothing changes. The answer is simple. You cannot harvest different fruit while planting the same mental seeds. Now we arrive at another force that determines every lasting transformation. Momentum. Most people believe momentum comes after results. The opposite is true. Results appear after internal momentum has already been created. Imagine a massive cargo ship leaving the harbor. For the first several minutes, its engines are working at full power. Yet from the shore, it barely seems to move. An impatient observer might conclude that nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, thousands of tons of steel are overcoming enormous inertia. Once the ship finally gains speed, keeping it moving requires far less energy than getting it started. Identity works exactly the same way. The first changes are invisible. No applause, no instant miracles. Your bank account doesn't suddenly double overnight. The only thing that changes at first is your direction. And direction sustained long enough eventually becomes destiny. That's why so many people quit too early. They wait for evidence before committing to a new identity, when the process actually works in reverse. First, you decide who you are. Then, you learn to think like that person. After that, you begin acting like that person. And finally, reality starts reflecting what was invisible all along. In the next section, you'll discover why this principle appears again and again in philosophy, psychology, and Neville Goddard's teachings, even though it completely contradicts ordinary logic. Because there is one question that truly abundant people answer very differently, and that answer changes every decision they make, long before the world gives them a single reason to believe. Identity always comes before evidence. There is one question that truly abundant people answer very differently, and that answer changes everything. The question is simple. Who are you? When life hasn't given you a reason to believe in yourself yet, not when everything is going well, not when the money starts flowing, not when people finally recognize you, but now, right now. Because the answer to that question determines the direction of every future decision you make. Most people answer from their circumstances. People who transform their reality answer from their identity, and that is where the real paradigm shift begins. From childhood, we're taught what seems like a perfectly logical sequence. First, you achieve results. Then you become confident. And finally, you develop a new identity. In other words, first you have, then you do, and eventually, you become. But Neville Goddard proposed the exact opposite. First you become, then you act. And finally, reality reorganizes itself around that identity, not because the universe operates like a reward machine, but because your perception, your decisions, and your behavior inevitably change when your self-image changes. Think about an actor. When an actor plays the same character for months, he doesn't simply memorize the lines. He starts walking differently, speaking differently, breathing differently, reacting differently, sometimes even after leaving the stage. Why? Because the brain responds powerfully to the identities it repeatedly assumes. It doesn't clearly distinguish between what is rehearsed and what is consistently repeated. Instead, it distinguishes between what feels internally consistent and what doesn't. That's precisely why so many affirmations fail. People repeat, "I am abundant," "I am successful," "I am wealthy." But the moment they finish speaking, they return to the same behaviors, the same decisions, the same fears, the same limitations. They are not assuming a new identity, they're simply repeating words, and words without alignment carry very little power. Here's a principle that changes everything. Identity is not demonstrated by what you say, it is demonstrated by what you repeatedly choose. Every decision silently answers one question: who do I believe I am? It doesn't matter what you tell yourself in front of the mirror. What matters is the identity from which you respond. When no one is watching, when an opportunity appears, when someone rejects you, when you lose money, when fear tries to regain control, that is where your real identity lives. And here's an uncomfortable realization. Most people don't actually have financial problems. They have habits that are perfectly aligned with an identity of scarcity. The difference is enormous, because a financial problem can often be solved with strategy. A scarcity identity turns even the best strategy into another repetitive cycle. That's why two people can receive exactly the same information, read the same book, attend the same seminar, invest in the same opportunity, and produce completely different outcomes. Information alone does not transform people. Interpretation does, and interpretation is always shaped by identity. Think about a compass. You can rotate the map as many times as you want. The needle always returns to true north. Identity works the same way. You can change careers, move to another city, leave a relationship, start a new business. But as long as your internal compass continues pointing toward the same version of yourself, your life will slowly reorganize itself around that direction. That's why so many people feel like they're making progress, only to end up exactly where they started. It wasn't a lack of effort. It was an internal direction that never changed. This brings us to another essential concept: identity reprogramming. And it's important to understand what that actually means. Reprogramming your identity does not mean lying to yourself. It does not mean pretending. It does not mean denying reality. It means refusing to let your past hold a monopoly over your future. Every time you say, "I've always been this way," people like me don't do that. "I've never been lucky," you're handing your future over to an outdated version of yourself. It's as if a photograph taken 10 years ago has the authority to decide who you're allowed to become tomorrow. But the past is not a prison. It's accumulated evidence, and evidence changes when the cause producing it changes. That was one of Neville Goddard's deepest teachings. Imagination is not an escape from reality. It is the laboratory where you rehearse your next identity. You don't imagine to avoid the present. You imagine to build internal alignment with the person you're becoming. Because every creation happens twice, first in the mind, then in the world. The same is true for a house before it physically exists. It exists as a blueprint. Before it's built, it exists as a decision. Before it becomes matter, it exists as an image held consistently. Visible reality always arrives second, never first. So here's the most important question in this entire video. How does someone think? Who is already abundant? Not necessarily someone with millions of dollars, but someone whose identity no longer depends on circumstances. The answer may surprise you. They don't constantly think about money. They consistently think from confidence. They don't make decisions to prove their worth. They make decisions because they already believe they are worthy. They don't seek approval. They seek alignment. They don't spend their lives waiting for signs. They become the sign. That difference may sound philosophical. In reality, it's profoundly practical, because it changes every conversation, every purchase, every investment, every relationship, every opportunity accepted or rejected. Identity functions like an invisible filter. It doesn't create opportunities. It determines which opportunities you're capable of recognizing Imagine buying a specific model of car. The next day, you suddenly notice that same car everywhere. Those cars didn't magically appear overnight. They were always there. What changed? Was your attention. Abundance works the same way. Changing your identity doesn't magically create opportunities. It allows you to notice opportunities your previous programming ignored. And once you notice them, you act differently. When you act differently, you produce different results. And those results reinforce the new identity. That's how a virtuous cycle begins, replacing the old cycle of scarcity. This is why transformation often feels as though it accelerates over time, not because reality suddenly changes, but because your internal alignment begins creating new momentum. First, your thoughts change, then your decisions, then your habits, and finally, your external world begins to look different, not because the world changed first, but because you stopped looking at it through the same identity. And now that you understand this principle, it's time to turn it into a practical system. Because a new identity isn't built through inspiration. It's built through conscious repetition. In the next section, you'll discover the 7 rules that will help you stop thinking like someone chasing abundance and start living like someone who already considers abundance a natural part of who they are. Reality changes when your identity stops negotiating with itself. By now, you've understood something fundamental. You don't need to become someone else. You simply need to stop behaving like the version of yourself you've already decided to leave behind. Because identity doesn't change in a single moment of inspiration. It changes through small decisions repeated until they no longer feel new. Here are 7 rules. Not to convince yourself that you're abundant, but to train a mind that no longer depends on circumstances to live that way. Rule 1. Stop consulting reality to decide who you are. The first transformation happens before any visible result appears. Here, you'll learn how to regain control over the story you tell yourself when circumstances seem to say otherwise. Most people wake up every morning asking reality who they are. If money is tight, they feel poor. If someone rejects them, they feel unworthy. If a project fails, they feel incapable. Their identity changes with every event. Ask yourself, how many times have you allowed one bad day to define who you believe you are? Rule 2. Think from the outcome, not toward it. This is where one of the biggest misunderstandings occurs. Most people think about abundance. Very few think from abundance. It sounds like a subtle distinction. It's a complete revolution. When you think toward a goal, there is always distance, there is always lack, there is always someday. But when you think from the outcome, your decisions change immediately. Become the answer first. Before making your next decision, pause, then ask yourself, what choice would the version of me who already lives this reality make? This isn't about spending money you don't have, or pretending to live a fake life. It's about choosing from calm, instead of fear. A master chess player doesn't move pieces based only on the current position of the board. He sees several moves ahead. His identity is already playing a game everyone else hasn't recognized yet. Are your decisions coming from the future you're building, or from the past you're trying to survive? Rule 3. Protect your spiritual economy. Money isn't the only form of capital you can lose. You can also lose attention, confidence, energy, clarity, and those assets often disappear long before money does. Here you'll learn to protect the most valuable resource you possess, your attention. Attention creates your world. Every conversation strengthens an identity. Every piece of content you consume reinforces a narrative. Every repeated thought builds a perception. That's why you must become extremely selective about what you allow into your mind. Not everything deserves your attention. Just as a wise investor carefully chooses where to place financial capital, an abundant person carefully chooses where to invest mental energy. Because they understand one simple truth: whatever receives consistent attention multiplies. Ask yourself, are you investing your attention or giving it away? Rule 4. Train decisions that match your new identity. Identity doesn't change when motivation appears. It changes when your actions remain aligned, even on ordinary days. This is where true radical discipline begins, not the discipline of punishing yourself, the discipline of refusing to negotiate with your former self. Choose before you feel. Emotions change. Principles remain. Every small decision strengthens a neural pathway. Every repetition makes your new identity more natural. Think about learning to play a musical instrument. The first notes feel awkward. Every movement feels unnatural. But eventually, your fingers know where to go without conscious effort. Identity becomes automatic the same way. The question is, which identity are you automating today? Rule 5. Normalize abundance before you see it. This is the rule that many people reject, because they confuse assumption with fantasy. They are not the same thing. Normalizing abundance doesn't mean pretending it has already happened. It means stopping the habit of treating it like something extraordinary. Make extraordinary feel ordinary. As long as success feels unbelievable, your mind will continue treating it like something that belongs to someone else. But once it begins to feel natural, you stop sabotaging it. Think about someone who has lived beside the ocean their entire life. Eventually, the sea is no longer extraordinary. It's simply home. Make abundance. Stop being a visitor. Let it become a resident. Ask yourself, why are you still treating as impossible what you want to experience every single day? Rule 6. Build invisible momentum. Every day. Most people quit just before change becomes visible, because they expect immediate rewards. They don't understand how transformation actually works. The invisible creates the visible. Every aligned thought, every conscious decision, every repeated action is building momentum. Even if you can't measure it yet, imagine pushing an enormous boulder uphill. The first few inches seem meaningless, but every push changes the starting point of the next one. Eventually, the movement no longer feels impossible. That's momentum. It doesn't suddenly appear. It is built. What action could you repeat today, even if nobody applauds it? Rule 7. Make identity a habit, not an emotion. This is where most people fail. They want to feel abundant before they act. They wait for motivation. They wait for confidence. They wait for certainty. And while they wait, life keeps moving. People who truly transform their reality understand something different. They don't depend on the emotional state of the day. They depend on their standards. Repetition defeats emotion. A strong identity doesn't need constant proof. It simply appears in every decision, just as someone who learned to read no longer consciously thinks about every letter. Eventually, the new identity becomes automatic. And once that happens, transformation no longer requires effort, because you're no longer performing a role. You have become the person. Now ask yourself the most uncomfortable question of this entire process. If someone watched every decision you make over the next 30 days, would they conclude that you truly believe in the identity you claim to have? Because the answer to that question is already creating the reality you'll live tomorrow. The world eventually reflects what you stop questioning about yourself. Let's return to where we began. I asked you to do something radical, to stop trying to become a millionaire, and start acting like someone who already is. Now you understand why. Because real transformation never begins when the money arrives. It begins when your identity stops waiting for permission to exist. Throughout this journey, we've dismantled one of the mind's greatest illusions, the belief that your circumstances must change before you can. But the process works in the opposite direction. First, your identity changes. Then your decisions change. Then your habits change. And finally, reality finds a way to align itself with that new direction. That's why the mistake we discussed at the beginning is so destructive. Most people try to manifest abundance from an identity of scarcity. They want security. While living in fear, they want wealth. While thinking like someone constantly trying not to lose what little they have, they want freedom. While continuing to define themselves through the limitations of their past, it's like trying to walk north, while every step is pointed south. It doesn't matter how much effort you make, direction always wins. You also discovered why some people seem to be lucky over and over again, not necessarily because they possess some hidden financial secret, and not because the universe plays favorites, but because they've developed an identity that recognizes opportunities where everyone else sees obstacles. They don't wait until they feel ready. They act like someone who has already decided who they are, and that decision transforms the way they observe, interpret, and respond to the world. That's exactly what you discovered in the fifth rule. Abundance stops feeling extraordinary. It becomes normal, and once it no longer feels impossible, you stop sabotaging it. Because the mind naturally protects whatever it considers part of itself, and rejects whatever feels unfamiliar. So the question is no longer whether you're capable of building a more abundant life. The real question is this: are you willing to let go of the identity that makes that life impossible? Because both versions of you cannot coexist forever. Every decision strengthens one and weakens the other. Starting today, you'll have hundreds of opportunities to choose. When fear appears, when an opportunity feels too big, when circumstances try to convince you to think the way you always have. That will be the real test, not the one that happens once, the one that happens every single day. Remember this: you are not training yourself to think positively. You are training yourself to become internally consistent. You are not trying to fool reality. You are finally stopping yourself from being fooled. And that difference changes everything. Because reality rarely responds to what you say you want. It responds, again and again, to who you consistently prove yourself to be. Maybe tomorrow nothing will look different. Your bank account may stay exactly the same. Your environment may not have changed at all. But if your identity begins changing today, you've already set in motion the only force capable of permanently transforming everything else. Visible reality always comes second. Always. So when this video ends, don't look for immediate proof. Look for alignment. Do one thing today that the abundant version of yourself would do without hesitation. Then do another tomorrow, and another the day after that. That is exactly how momentum is built. Not through massive breakthroughs, but through small decisions that become impossible to stop. Because one day, you will no longer be acting like an abundant person. You will simply be that person. If this video changed the way you understand abundance, write this in the comments. Today, I assume my new identity. Don't write it to convince anyone else. Write it as a commitment to yourself. And subscribe only if you're willing to stop negotiating with the limited version of yourself and build an identity that no longer depends on circumstances to believe in its own worth. Because the day you stop chasing abundance is the day abundance stops running from you.